All right, everyone having fun so far? Is everyone O-KEDA? Yeah, that's a nice pun. All right, so I'm going to talk about KEDA today, which is the Kubernetes event-driven autoscaler. I don't have time to get into what it is, but you'll see what you shouldn't do with it. So if this is where you are in your journey of implementing KEDA and then trying to figure out profit, I'm going to talk about this middle part right here. So there's really 5 phases of adopting KEDA within your organization. The first is accepting that you need a new autoscaler, right? The second is you got to figure out how to say the name. I call it KEDA because I saw a video on YouTube and someone called it KEDA. There was a lot of debates. We spent more time on bullet number 2 than we probably want to admit. The third is to implement it. The fourth is what I call the trough of despair, and then the fifth obviously is profit. I'm going to talk about the trough of despair today. So our old auto-scaling mechanism, this is a graph, an artist representation of a graph that shows the messages we had coming into our components over time and our auto-scaling. So the red is the number of pods we have. And so the problem we had is we scaled really, really slow. And we wanted to save more money by contracting our cluster at the end of the day. And there was this great quote that I found online that says, one of the coolest features of KEDA is its ability to scale your application back to 0 when there are no events to process. This can lead to significant cost savings. That's exactly what we wanted. That's really, really cool. So we implemented KEDA, and it was great. We did exactly what that quote said. We could scale up fast. We could scale down fast when there was no events to process. We had 0 pods. Everything was going great. But remember that trough of despair that I talked about? So the problem was that this is what our messages look like at like 3 in the morning. Now you don't normally have a pile of messages in our system coming in at 3 in the morning, and so our engineer got a page that's not actually a picture of the engineer, but we don't need to talk about that. So you look and say, well, why was the engineer page? Why did all those messages get piled up? Well, there's a big clue right here when we had no pods. And this was an interesting discovery to us because we had a new autoscaler. Why wouldn't we have pods? Well, so I had a little amendment to this quote that I needed to make. Right? So I said before you can scale to 0 when you have no messages. There's an addendum, or if the KED's metric server gets evicted from your cluster. Now, I'm sure this was in the documentation, and there's like 3 lines of YAML that we implemented in order to solve this problem, but that was a really, really interesting discovery at 3 in the morning. So once we moved on from that, we had some more exciting problems. So this was our old scaling patterns. It looks like pyramids, and all of our plots you can see we'd scale up, we'd scale down like pyramids. The new one kind of looked like skyscrapers, a city skyline, right? So the problem was, and you can see on the graph on the left-hand side, we would move like 10 pods at a time, 2 pods, depending on the deployment that we had. Well, now that we can scale with just reckless abandon, we can add like 2,000 pods immediately, which is really, really cool, but you're at a Kubernetes conference, and you're probably familiar with some other problems that can create. So the problem is our system, which was pretty darn mature at this point, and we've rung out a lot of scalability problems, we hadn't rung these out before. So what happened was, by scaling up immediately like this, we started running into all sorts of rate limits that we had never seen before. So we ran into S3 rate limits that we had never encountered. We ran into STS rate limits running in AWS. So the challenge was that because we scaled so slow before, we were masking a lot of latent defects that we had in our code that we had no idea about. So all of this was really, really exciting and trying to turn that. And then we started to climb out of the trough of despair. And so now we started to tune it, which is really the fun part of doing all this. So if you look at this plot, you can see that our messages were kind of coming and going. And the problem was our pod count had dropped to 0. Now our application was running in JRuby, which that's a whole other conversation, but it's not the most efficient thing to start and stop. So every time the message count got cleared out, we would scale down to 0. And then some messages would obviously pile back up. We'd scale back up. We waste a lot of time starting up pods to basically starting code over and over again. So what we learned was that we had to go be a little bit less eager in the way that we processed our messages. And so what we did is, if you look at this message pattern, we never quite dropped to 0, and then the pod count never drops to 0 either. So what I did is, we called this, we determined that we should make our messages smooth out a little bit more. And so we called this the nightclub theory. So no one wants to go to a nightclub when there's no one out the back door, so instead you have to have that line out the door all the time, because then people see how cool that nightclub is and people want to go to your pod and do processing. It's not the greatest metaphor, but it's fun. It's fun to tell people about the nightclub theory and they go, what are you talking about? So anyway, the long story short, the takeaway from this is that KEDA really is awesome. But if you're going to go and implement it in your organization, you should be prepared for some unexpected surprises along the way. I obviously didn't have time to dig into all these, but feel free to hit me up. My contact information is there. You guys can find me afterwards. Thank you guys. Enjoy the rest of your conference.